This is the third Sunday of our four-Sunday look at the Reformation. I'm going to call today Generation 2. And then next week we'll talk about the Reformation as it happened in England and Scotland. We've got to talk about the Scots because we're Presbyterian. And we've got to work John Knox in here somewhere. So we're getting John Knox next week and contrast what happened in Scotland and England, two very different paths to Reformation. But today we're going to talk about the second generation, and that, of course, brings us to John Calvin. He was born in 1509 and died in 1564. If you know 1509, the big year for the Reformation to kick off with Luther and the 95 Theses and all that stuff was 1517. So it meant that Calvin was all of 8 or 9 years old when that started. So he clearly was of a different generation than Luther was. Question came up: did Luther and Calvin ever have any personal interaction at all? And as far as we can tell, no, they didn't. Luther, under most of his adult life, was technically an outlaw, so he couldn't really travel around anywhere he wanted to. Calvin, on the other hand, was French. He was born in France, lived most of his adult life, and his ministry was in Geneva, which is a French city. Even though it's part of Switzerland, it's still very much a French city. So they had two different paths what they were on. Again, mentioned Calvin was born in France. He was educated in Paris. His father intended him to be a lawyer, so not a bad thing there. But during the 1530s, when he was in his early 20s, he had a conversion experience. Luther's conversion experience, you'll recall, was very dramatic. He was riding along one day out in the country, and there was a bolt of lightning almost hit him and caused him to rethink his ways. Calvin's was more intellectual. He just kind of looked at the Catholic Church, what they were doing, thought that really couldn't be reconciled with what the Bible said. So he had more of a gradual conversion. This again was all still in France. He had to leave France in the early 1530s. There were a lot of Protestants in France, even though the country was still officially Catholic, and the king was very Catholic. King Francis of France was very Catholic, but he never really got around to leaning on the Protestants too hard. He was continually at war with Emperor Charles V, until one day, somebody in France, we don't know who, got the right idea that if Luther got some attention by having one notice up on a church door, they were going to have a whole bunch. So simultaneously, all across France, you had all these statements appear on church doors, denouncing the Mass, denouncing the Pope supremacy, and so forth. And that would have probably gone all right, except one of them ended up on the bedroom door of the king. And that freaked him out. Somebody got into his house like that. And so at that point, the Protestants pretty much were underground, and they had to either flee or go. And Calvin, that drove Calvin to first to Strasbourg and then to Geneva. So he was as I mentioned, very much of an intellectual. Was not nearly as personable as Luther was. He let his pen do the talking for them. And in 1536, he wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And he worked on that all the rest of his life. Institutes probably could be translated better as principles or basics. And it's gone through many publications, many translations. It's still looked at. And I think it's fair to say that 90% of what we do as Presbyterians is probably based on the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And all of we have that book of Confessions that we have been looked at over the years. Probably 90% of those are based directly from the Institutes of Christian Religion. So, by Calvin. So, again, he wrote that in 1536. He was still only 27 years old. when he wrote that. So that was his. He was very precocious when he turned that out. Um, Problem was he also Calvin um, was kind of a one way or the highway kind of guy, and you either agreed with him, or if you didn't, it was because you were bad or stupid. And so people at Geneva didn't really care for that approach, especially when he kept telling them how they should live their lives. Um, for example, he was very big on honoring the Sabbath. So that meant that on Sunday, you shut everything down. No shops, no entertainment, no, you sat at home and read your Bible. Well, the merchants didn't like that. That went over like a lead balloon to the merchants. And by 1537, he was induced to leave town rather abruptly. So um, he came back eventually and got kind of moderated, but he was still very much a serious kind of guy. One commentator I read said, get a better understanding of Calvin's character, Calvin would be a great guy to have at a dinner party for your guests to talk to, and he'd be the center of attention, and everyone to talk to the great man. If you wanted to go down to the bar on the corner and have a beer, Luther was your guy, not Calvin. He probably would have been a terrible, terrible guy to do that with. Um, so that gives you an idea of the different personality of the two different men. I mentioned that Calvin never met Luther. He was very much aware of what he was doing. Luther was still out there. Luther didn't. He passed away in 1546, so their careers overlapped a little bit. Luther was still out there actively preaching and writing hymns. He was a big hymn writer. Mighty Fortress is Our God. That's our famous one that we know. He wrote that initially to be sung to a bar tune in Germany, so everybody would know the tune. It's easier to learn a song if you know the tune already. So he just fit the words to the bar tune, and the song that we sing um, is very different than what he actually wrote. And so I found the literal translation of what he actually wrote, and you'll get the idea when you listen to this. It's syncopated to the music that he set it to. I don't have the music, but he said so. Instead of a mighty fortress, it starts off: a safe stronghold, our God is still, a trusty shield and weapon. He'll help us clear from all the ill that hath us o'ertaken. The ancient prince of hell hath risen with purpose fell. Strong mail of craft and power, he weareth not in this hour. On earth is not his fellow. So it's same. It's kind of the same. You can see the same underlying message, but it's da 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 da. Where the one we sing is not like that. So. But anyhow, Calvin wrote a letter to Luther, telling what a great man he was and how he admired him. But he also set forth his ideas on certain topics, including communion. And he was very much of the Swiss school of the communion idea that Christ isn't really actually there. It's more of a presence. He's not literally there. And Luther, of course, was, this is my body broken for you. Christ was actually there. And so he delivered it to a guy named Philip Melanchthon, who was kind of an intermediary. Melanchthon read the letter and then said, no, I'm not going to deliver this. So as far as we know, Luther never saw it. Luther knew about Calvin. He mentioned him in his letters. They probably would not have gotten along well together if they'd met. So probably just as well if they never did meet. Calvin, as I mentioned, came back to Geneva in 1541. He preached every week for the rest of his life, the next 20-some years, and he wrote. He wrote like crazy. He wrote commentaries on books of the Bible to let people understand them better. He wrote 24 commentaries on the Old Testament books, all the prophets, the first five books, Psalms, and a couple other ones. And he wrote commentaries on every book in the New Testament except for one. Can you guess which one that was? Revelation. So, don't be upset if Pastor Helen doesn't preach much on Revelation. If John Calvin can't figure out what Revelation means, then that's everybody else should get a pass. I mean, I can just imagine him getting through about halfway through that and looking at it and going, "Oh hell no, I can't do this." So no revelation from John Calvin. So nobody else since then nobody's tried to touch it either. So um, but these commentaries he turned out about 50 of these, which means he was writing. He wrote on average 3 or 4 hours a day. So that's try to keep that up. Most of us couldn't do that for one day, let alone for 25 years. But he did that. And so, again, with the printing press the way it was, these were published, sent all over Europe. So by the end of his life, he probably had fame equal to that of Luther, if not more. Again, as I mentioned, Calvin was kind of a one-way or the highway kind of guy. And he did have some problems with people showing up thinking that he was tolerant and moderate, and he wasn't. There was a guy named Michael Servetus who showed up in Geneva in 1553 after fleeing from the Catholics. And Michael was a reformer to the nth degree. His position was this concept of the Trinity. It doesn't say anything about the Trinity in the New Testament. The Trinity word is never used in the New Testament. So we can just forget about the Trinity. Just one God. That's it. Forget about Jesus. Forget about Holy Spirit. Just one God. Well, that went over very poorly with Calvin. And they let him have every chance to leave or shut up, and he wouldn't do either one. So he ended up getting burned at the stake. And Calvin had to sign off on that, and he did. So these guys were not perfect by our standards, and that's the problem when you try to apply modern day standards to all these guys. None of them are going to pass the test. But that's he did that. Okay, there was still fighting in Germany back and forth. Yes.
Over 60 years ago, Western civilization women there really, he found out I was vegetarian. He wanted me to defend predestination. And he did a really torrent to me. I said, I don't believe in it. I'm Presbyterian. That doesn't mean. Mm-hmm. And then she went in and said this when he said, for the sake. She said, oh, Calvin, he didn't believe what he believed. He put thousands of people to death. I never heard that before. No. I never did research it. But she threw that out, that he was so intolerant that anybody was pleasing.
No, that's not true. Okay. I mentioned this because that's the only guy I know. Maybe that's the bias of her. Yeah, well, he was big on predestination, and I'm not going to touch that much because I don't really understand the concept. And as far as I've been waiting in this church now for 20 years to have a sermon preached on that topic, and I'm still waiting. So apparently the modern Presbyterian church doesn't do much with it either. That was one of the things that Calvin was, his position was that you were either saved or you weren't, and it wasn't anything you could do to change that. God did it before all time began. That's another thing that he and Luther differed with. Luther said no, that's not right because people put themselves in hell; they don't get sent there by God. So I think that's probably more what the modern church leans to. But that was throughout the centuries, Presbyterian predestination. They were equated. So, but as far as putting people, no, this is the only guy that ever happened to. He had differences with other reformers over communion, over baptism, other things, but no. Geneva, the Swiss were very tolerant. People went to the Swiss one, and people went to the Netherlands. Those are the two really havens for religious thought tolerance in Europe at this time. So, anyhow, the Germans were still kind of bickering back and forth, and finally, Charles V, who's still around, imposed this rule that said that the people have to follow the religion of the ruler. So if you were in places like Brandenburg or Saxony or the Rhineland, and the Duke or wherever said, "I'm going to be Lutheran," then people had to be Lutheran, or they had to leave, or risk being persecuted. If you were in the South, in Bavaria, some of that, and of course, the Catholics said, "We're in charge here." So it basically was it forced the people to choose which part of Germany they wanted to live in, and there was a migration from south to north and north to south, so that by 1600 you get pretty much even lines drawn. And there's I have a little map in back here. That's kind of goes to show where that's not really, it's kind of misleading. It makes it look like it's more Presbyterian or Protestant than it is across Germany. Germany was actually pretty much cut up, divided up in half. But it goes to show the where the people were scattered around um, Europe. France was still mostly Catholic. Um, it's estimated at this time France was the biggest country in Europe in terms of population. They had about 20 million people, and about 2 million of those were Protestants. So that's still a pretty small minority, but still it's 2 million people. Um, and then there were scattered in Poland and a few in Ireland, not many in Italy at all, or Spain or Portugal. They were pretty much solid Catholic still. But Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, and Scandinavia, and then England. We'll talk about England next week, and Scotland. Um, so I don't like this. They made there's one color that's orange and one color that's red, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the two of them. You look at England and think in Scotland, and think it's all the same. It's not. Scotland is a little darker red. That's where the Presbyterians were, of course. So that gives you an idea how much it had spread over just a few decades across Europe, and that's pretty much the way it is today. Um, hasn't really changed much since then. So, all right. In addition to preaching and writing, Calvin also there was a university there, and he taught there as well. Had students come from all over Europe, including somebody called John Knox, who shows up in 1556, um, who bounces around. Calvin, I mentioned Luther stayed pretty much all his life in Germany. Calvin, after leaving France, went to Switzerland, and then he would sometimes go to southern Germany like Strasbourg, but he was pretty much in Switzerland the rest of his life. John Knox, on the other hand, bounced around all over Europe. He was in Scotland, then he was in England, and then he came to Switzerland to study under Knox or Calvin. Then he went back to Switzerland or Scotland. So he bounced around all over the place, much so more than these other guys did. But that's a lot more on him. But as far as we can tell, while he was in Geneva, that's when he came up with the idea that churches should be run by a council of elders. And the first century word for that is presbyters, Greek word. So that's where the Presbyterian came from. That was the dividing. And of course, so that when you see a church today and they call themselves Presbyterian, that doesn't really tell you what they believe. It tells you what kind of structure they have inside the church. You could have liberal Presbyterian churches, conservative Presbyterian churches. It doesn't tell you much about what they believe, but it just that's what he came up with in Geneva under the tutelage of John Calvin. So let's see. Again, Calvin and Luther could not agree on communion. Um, what we believe today that Christ is present in the communion, His real presence is there. He's not in the bread or the wine or the grape juice, but His presence is there. And that's something the Lutherans still today believe, that Christ, He really is in the communion elements somehow. They don't know how, but somehow He is. It seems like a pretty small difference to me, but it's pretty big to them. So, and again, you could probably write 15 things down that they agreed on, and the one thing they didn't agree on was the communion. And it seems too bad, but that's the way it was. Again, the Reformed service was the same in terms of what the church looked like. We've got a picture in here you might want to look at. This is a idea of what a Reformed service looked like, um, I think in the Netherlands. But you see there's no stained glass, no banners, no statues. You've got the preacher there in the middle. That's a raised um, pulpit so that he can preach. That's the central part of the worship is the preaching. It's interesting. The women are down in the front on benches by themselves, and they have the children off on smaller benches, and then the men are scattered around the rest of the service. Um, yeah, so dogs are apparently welcome then too. So, but that's what it looked like. And of course, every church was different, but the idea they were much simpler in their services than the Catholics. And that was again a uniform feature. Let's see. Mm-hmm. I've gotten I put together a little sheet here. Um, again, outlining the disputes that they had. I'm not going to really go into that very much. It's kind of technical. And you notice for the first time here, I've got Luther, Zwingli, which is the other Swiss reformer, was right before Calvin. Um, Calvin, and then Cranmer. Um, we'll meet him next week. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, reformer who set up the Anglican Church in England. So that's the Anglican perspective, and they pretty much were all the same, with various degrees of difference. The big difference down here at the bottom, you'll read, is on baptism. We'll talk about that now. Baptism, Luther and Calvin did not have any kind of disagreements over baptism. They continued to have the Roman Catholic practice of sprinkling infants. And that was one thing that the Catholics did that Luther and Calvin didn't have any problem with. But there were some folks who came along very quickly after Luther got started, well before even Calvin got started writing, who said, wait a minute, if we really want to get back to the first century, they didn't sprinkle infants in the first century. All the baptisms you read about in the first century are by immersion. John the Baptist started it even before Christ started his ministry. And in Acts, when people are baptized, it's by immersion. So this sprinkling stuff, we need to get rid of that. That's not right. So they became known as the Anabaptists, or second baptism. They didn't like that term. Their approach was that first baptism you had as a child was no good. It wasn't real baptism, so it didn't really count. And if it had been, I think they could have probably gotten away with it if they simply said, "Hey, we like to baptize this way. You can baptize your way, and we're all fine." But they went out of their way to say, "No, your baptisms, all your baptisms, Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, they're all bad. Don't count. No good. Only our way counts." Well, that raised up everybody's hand against them. So they didn't have a place to hide. They weren't going to be persecuted by somebody. And they were, big time. Um, and again, that's not the same as today's Baptists. Today's Baptists do baptize by immersion, but they came along later. They're not. They have the same name, but they're not the same. But again, by the 1520s, these people were around in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Switzerland. They were all over the place. It was get caught on very fast, because not only did they want to baptize adults, but they also went for a simpler, what they thought was more Christ-like lifestyle. They wouldn't swear oaths of allegiance to any governmental unit. They wouldn't serve in the military to anybody. They believed in sometimes in communal living, sharing their possessions. All these things that just raised alarm bells with everybody across Europe except the Anabaptists. Now today they're still around today. We don't call them Anabaptists. We call them Amish. We call them Mennonites. We call them, there's some here in south part of the county, the Old Order German Baptist, the Dunkards. You still see them around with the women with the little hats and men with the beards. They're Anabaptists, so they survived. They haven't been numerous, but they're still there. Um, and I've got a little handout on them too, if you want to look at that at your leisure. Um, Again, they were very big on. They were the first ones that really do evangelism. They sent out missionaries across Europe to spread the idea, and picked up a lot of believers. Holland, Bohemia, um, the Baltic, they were all over. There weren't a lot of them, but they were all over. Um, and again, whereas the Catholics had the cardinals, the Pope, the cardinals, and the priests, the Lutherans had bishops and then ministers. Anabaptists, congregation was it. They didn't have even ministers. Everybody was minister. And just to give you an idea of how people were committed to their faith back in those days, I've got a little list here of what happened to some of them. Um, Generally, if you were in a Catholic part of Europe, you got burned. If you were in a Protestant part of, you got beheaded. Or the Swiss were more squeamish, I guess. They would just throw you off the bridge into a river. Um, so same effect. But that's you can see in the even the 1520s what kind of these are the leaders too. So we don't even know of the followers. There were probably hundreds, thousands. So these people really were willing to sacrifice everything they had, including their lives, for what they believed. Um, and Calvin did not burn thousands of them at the stake. He didn't do that. But that was the so that's another thing that they Calvin wrote against a lot. Um, all right, what else? I make a point about mentioning Menno Simons. He was the founder of the Mennonites. He's one of the very few ones who actually lived to die a natural death, because he was on the run for most of his life. Um, and from him, the Mennonites get their name. About the only place they could survive in Europe was in the Netherlands. The Netherlands was a very tolerant place. At least the northern part was what we now call the Netherlands. Back then, the Low Countries were known as Belgium and the Netherlands together. Um, and by the 1570s, you had pretty much religious peace that had come over Switzerland and Germany. Um, but that was not the case across all of Europe. Um, in the Netherlands, that was owned by, at the time, Spain. Spain had the Low Countries, and Charles the Fifth's son, a guy named Philip, was a very militant Catholic. He said he'd rather rule over a desert than a country full of heretics, and he did his best to turn the Netherlands into that. Before the Dutch beat him to it by breaking all the dikes and flooding the country, and that was the only way they were able to beat the Spanish. But they did. They fought them for about 50 years, off and on. But they finally were able to get their freedom from the Spanish. I mentioned France. The French Protestants were known as Huguenots, and there were, again, a lot of them, not nearly enough to make a difference, but there were a lot of them, mostly in the west and south of the country. They were persecuted relentlessly. Um, Most famous event was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. They had a bunch of them come to Paris because one of their leaders was going to be married to the King of France's sister, and so they didn't know that was just an excuse by the Catholic leaders to get them all in one place at one time, and there were several thousand killed on the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Um, that was the last sermon that John Knox ever preached before he died, was in response to that atrocity. So they were still there, but they were under a lot of persecution. Um, I mentioned Germany last week not being really a country, but more of a geographic expression. Switzerland the same way. Switzerland, there was no country called Switzerland during this time. There were a lot of individual little cantons. Some were Protestant, some were Catholic, and they fought back and forth, um, but not nearly to the extent that these other countries did, because there was nobody that had the majority. So they pretty much had to get along with each other, because nobody couldn't impose their will on anybody else. Let's see. Um, by the time that Calvin died, um, you started having the first generation and second generation of reformers pass away. And so it was kind of like what happened with the early church. Once the apostles died and the people who knew them died, uh, people felt it was necessary to actually write down what Jesus did. And so we got the Gospels coming from the last few decades of the first century. Well, now that these reformers are dying, the same thing happened. It became necessary to try to write down what the Reformation was all about. So we start getting these confessions and catechisms. Presbyterians are famous for their book of confessions. We've got about what, 12, 13, 14. Three of them come from this period of time. We've got the Heidelberg Catechism, of the Second Swiss Confession, and also the one we'll talk about next week, the Scots Confession, that John Knox put together. So these catechisms and confessions basically are question and answer. What is communion? What does baptism mean? Why do we do this? And so they were put together, kind of give you an idea of how it worked. If Heidelberg came out in 1562, a German prince said, "I want to try to get something to hammer out community differences between Protestants or Lutherans and Calvinists." And so they put together for him. He gets hauled up before the imperial diet on charges of heresy, and so they had to put another one together to defend him, which is the Second Swiss Confession. Um, and these confessions, each one of them is longer than the one before, and each one of them is more detailed than the one before. With the exception of the Scots Confession, not John Knox and a couple of his buddies knocked that out over a long weekend. But they get longer and longer and more detailed, trying to anticipate everything that could come up. So both, again, the Heidelberg Catechism and the Swiss Confession are part of our confessions here in the PC USA. Although a lot of it is out of date now. But there's a lot of language in these things that attacks the Pope. I don't think the PC USA officially still calls the Pope the Antichrist. I don't think so. Hope not. But they do. But again, you have to kind of pick and choose what you want. Um, so those confessions were done. Actually, both those were done before Calvin died. But Calvin died in 1564, and then the movement went on to in other hands. So let's see what else. I kind of like this. I included this in your packet. We know from I don't know how it got preserved, but there was somebody, apparently a student, who got bored one day listening to Calvin, so he doodled this. That's was doodled by a student listening to Calvin um, drone on about some point, and so we have several of these. He did several teachers that he had, and this is what Calvin looked like. So um, it's Calvin's always pictured with having a long beard and black hat and so forth. Um, but that's students have not changed that much over these centuries, I guess. All right. Any questions? Yeah, the community down by Yoder is and Heston and around Hutchinson. Those are Mennonites. They use machinery. Um, the old order Amish are the ones you see with the buggies. Although they're old order Amish in Iowa, as well as Pennsylvania and Ohio. But no, the ones down by Wichita or Hutchinson those are Mennonites. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Mennonites are still famous for their relief work. If there's a natural disaster, they'll one of the first ones there. Um, and of course, they also are still pacifists. They don't will not serve in the military, but their conscientious objector status has been recognized, so they're not compelled to do that. So, yeah.
I just wanted to add what you said about Calvin and Book of Revelation that Luther had written. There were two New Testament books he finally had out of the Bible. The other one was James, because
Oh yeah.
it seems to encourage works righteousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how you'd have trouble with that.
Revelation, they did have that. Couldn't figure it out.
Yeah. I'm surprised that Calvin. He apparently wrote a commentary on Daniel and Ezekiel, and apparently he had no trouble with the strange imagery in those two. But apparently got to maybe did those first, and then he got to Revelation. He went, okay, enough. I'm not doing this. I'm not touching this. So.
That's better than making it up. How many of other people in the world? Well, I'm sure it means this.
Well, yeah, but he, I think, yeah. So, I guess his life was too short to waste on Revelation. So, uh, yeah.
Comment on the Amish. Something that said there was the order.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he didn't mind that. He didn't, as far as we know, he didn't write songs like Luther did, but they were actually they were much closer together than they were. I mean, their differences were pretty small compared to the similarities. So, um, if you went to a reform service in Switzerland or the Netherlands, um, it'd be much similar than what you. Although, if today, if you go to like the Lutheran Church at 15th in Iowa, um, is that Emmanuel Lutheran, the University Lutheran? It's Missouri Synod. So if you go in there, unless you're a Missouri Synod, you can't take communion. So it's still they have that level barrier there, whereas Reformed churches don't have that. It's open to all. So
The Calvinists said a lot of songs, and there was a famous hymn writer. We have some of those things. But
out of that, they focus a lot on singing the song. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Let's see. All right, well, next week, to give you a preview, we'll follow up on the life of John Knox. Here's a little tidbit. He survived being a galley slave for a year and a half on a French galley, and was finally released. And that was before he even came to Geneva. So he was not a young man when he survived that. So he had a very colorful life, more so than these other two guys we've talked about too, which stood him in good stead because Scotland was a pretty rough place at the time, and they kind of played for keeps. So let's see, anything else? Well, that's what I've got for today. So yeah.